good morning, everyone. I think it's with a great sense of excitement that we are able to come to a gathering like this. I heard from some other people in the audience just before that it's like the first bigger gathering with a lot of international guests. And the fact that this has been possible despite the background of the pandemic, I think should give us excitement, right? We look forward to more opening and more opportunities to exchange things again. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the role of vaccines in public health. But before we get to that, for the sake of the audience, I wanted to briefly give your respective backgrounds, if that's okay. So allow me to read that I don't do any injustice to any of the panel members. Professor Benjamin Seet is the Deputy Group Chief Executive Officer of Education and Research with the National Healthcare Group, a public healthcare group that includes National Center for Infectious Diseases, which is at the forefront of the fight against COVID here in Singapore. He was also appointed Executive Director of the Biomedical Research Council in 2012 and was previously with the Agency for Science, Technology and Research, dubbed A*STAR, where he was overseeing its biomedical research institutes, centers and consortia that engage in scientific and translational R&D spanning various industries. Then online, virtually, we have Dr. Priya Agrawal. She has been trained as an obstetrician and gynecologist in the United Kingdom. Priya received her degrees in medicine from the University of Cambridge and University of Oxford, and she graduated with a master's in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health. Priya has a strong track record of advancing successful public health initiatives and innovations within the private and public sectors. She's currently the global lead at MSD for the human papillomavirus vaccines, and she previously served at MSD as Chief Behavioral Science Officer for Global Vaccines, was the Managing Director for South Africa and the Sub-Saharan African Cluster. And she led the Vaccines and Women's Health Business Unit in the UK prior to that. Prior to MSD, she was the Director of Research and Innovation at the Harvard School of Public Health, where she led the development and evaluation of digital healthcare innovations. Professor Gagandeep Kang, also known as Sherry, is an esteemed scientist known for her research on enteric infectious diseases in impoverished communities specifically. She's currently the Executive Director at the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute in Faridabad in India, and she is also the head of the Wellcome Trust Research Lab at the Christian Medical College at Vellore, India. She has published over 200 papers in national and international journals. She sits on the editorial board of scientific journals and is on several review committees for national and international research funding agencies. Professor Kang is a member of the WHO Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety, on the Immunization and Vaccine Implementation Research Advisory Committee, and she chairs the Immunization Technical Advisory Group for WHO's Southeast Asian region. And she's on the board of Hilleman Laboratories. And last but not least, Dr. Gerd Zettlmeissl. He's the former Chief Executive Officer for the Austria-based biotech company Intercell that later became Valneva. He's an accomplished vaccine expert and business executive. He has more than 25 years of scientific and leadership experience within the biopharmaceutical industry. While at Intercell from 2001 to 2012, he has built the company from a private startup to a publicly listed international organization with more than 400 employees. As CEO, he secured regulatory approval and led the launch of an improved Japanese encephalitis vaccine and oversaw efforts to build an advanced and a broad-based development portfolio of vaccines. Prior to Intercell, Dr. Zettlmeissl had senior management roles at Chiron and Beringwerke. He currently still serves on several supervisory boards, and he's also been the chairman of the board at Hilleman Labs. I call you welcome. Perhaps we can take off our mask. I think that may facilitate our discussion a little bit, and we have a safe distance. I hope that's okay with the organizers. If I'm not being hauled off, we should be all right. I would like to go for the first question. So COVID is in the midst of all this. How do you feel COVID has impacted the development and the use of vaccines? How have we demonstrated the value of vaccines? And perhaps, Benjamin, you're sitting closest to me, and you've been in the midst of leading public health efforts here in Singapore. Perhaps I can first call on you?
Okay, so I think, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to today's meeting. And I guess I can speak from Singapore's perspective. I think we've been fairly fortunate that at this point in time, we've vaccinated 92% of the population, and about 66% have been boosted. And I guess a very quantitative answer to your question is a very recent study by our Ministry of Health, which showed that during the Delta outbreak, based on modeling that they've did, we have actually averted as many as 8,000 deaths, avoided 33,000 serious infections, and kept 112,000 people out of hospital. So that is modeling, but again, it just shows that once we are able to achieve a very high level of vaccination, there is aversion, prevention of disease, and hospitalization. And in a small country like Singapore, which is so dense, I think dense in terms of population density, I think this actually is a very clear demonstration that vaccines made a huge difference. The fact that we're even able to have the conference we're having today without masks would not have been possible just 2 years ago.
Thank you for that, without mask, I hear you. So, Dr. Agrawal, Priya, you're remote. I hope you can hear us. Can I call on you?
Thank you.
Can I ask for your thoughts on this first question?
Of course. First of all, not only is there a value of vaccines, but COVID has made me realize the value of being in person. So I'm sorry that I can't be there with all of you, but thank you for inviting me to the panel. So I think those of us that have been sort of struggling with plateauing or declining vaccination rates in many countries will say, in the past, vaccines have become victims of their own success. And so I think what COVID-19 vaccines have done is they've put vaccines back where they belong, in the spotlight. You know, I think we'll agree that COVID-19 vaccines have been a marvel of modern science. And as others have said, data has shown that the health, economic, and societal benefits have been clear. I think also COVID-19 has shown us the value of innovation, both like breakthrough innovation that brought forth the COVID-19 vaccines, but also incremental innovation that allows us as an industry to keep improving vaccines. So in this case, addressing variants and waning immunity. But I think it's important to say that, we'll all agree vaccines don't save lives on their own, vaccinations do. So I think we do need to take account of the fact that the pandemic has revealed how undervalued and underfunded immunization programs have been prior to this. The underinvestment has contributed to gaps in the rollout of the COVID vaccines. And one could argue we haven't had enough funding into implementation research that actually can inform the how of successful immunization programs. So I really hope moving forward, like Dr. Rao said, Hilleman Laboratories has such a great role to play, both from the laboratories and the manufacturing. But I think we need to invest both in the ecosystems that reward and foster innovation, but also in the research that ensures sustainable immunization programs.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Very good contribution. And it actually links to some degree to the previous presentation. Sherry, can I call upon you?
Sure. I think we wouldn't be here if we didn't all want a better, safer world where health is a priority for everyone. But we have to recognize that sometimes we are not the people who make the policies, no matter how much we'd like to try. Policies are made by people who are elected for relatively short periods of time, who have to be responsive to the people who elected them. And health is not always a priority. In a pandemic, this was an opportunity for us. And the question to me now is that opportunity, all the gains that we've made, going to persist into the future if there isn't sustenance of this pandemic or new threats that emerge? I think what has happened is that we built on a lot of science that had already been done. We had new science that brought us new vaccines. And if we look from the point of low and middle income countries, there was a small increase in science, nothing like what happened in the Western world, but there was a large increase in the intention to make vaccines and to bring vaccine science to LMICs. I hope that is something that the world will sustain, that countries will commit to and continue to work on. But I think the other thing to think about, as Priya said, is vaccination and what happened with vaccination from the less developed part of the world. I think we switched from routine immunization, which is immunizing essentially children and immunizing mothers with the intention of protecting neonates, to actually thinking about adult immunization, to being able to deliver on adult immunization, and in many places do that very, very well. Africa continues to struggle for a variety of reasons that include but are not limited to supply. But I think if we are going to build that better, safer world, we do need to be thinking about vaccines and about vaccination and about the populations that we address through vaccination in the future.
Right, thank you. Very good. Gerd?
Yeah, a lot has been said, and I don't want to repeat, and just would like to raise another aspect, and this is the aspect of science and the role of science in biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies. And if I look at the vaccine development and COVID and the benefit we got out of it, at the end it was not a result of the last 12 months. It was a result of many, many years of research which has been done in different areas, in academia, but a lot also in companies. So just take one example, if you look at the RNA vaccines, which made most of the impact in the COVID, companies and organizations have been working on that for a decade or longer, and with little success. So it took almost 10 years that, one found finally the solution with the LMPs to finally get this technology working. Similar for the adenoviruses. So we did long research, many years in adenoviruses, and finally, at the right point in time, they were available for COVID, as was the RNA. And the RNA vaccines have been having their first success, really, clinically, with any disease, with COVID. And I've been working in the field, and, there was nothing working up to now. And so I really, and then I saw that really, the interaction between biotech and pharmaceutical companies worked very well. So there have been very nice collaborations at the end of the day leading to the vaccines we have today. So I would like to really take as a learning and out of this COVID that, makes sense to work on platforms. It makes sense to work on new ideas for vaccines in the future in order to be even better prepared than we have been for this pandemic.
So thank you for that. And I think, it's been, of course, a crisis in many ways, COVID, but it's also been an opportunity, and that's what I hear a little bit. Value of vaccines has been demonstrated in different ways, lives saved, but also opportunities of the industry to work more closely together, get vaccines accelerated, perhaps bring more interest in LMICs for production as well. So these are a number of upsides. In society, there was something remarkable also, and I think we've all struggled with that. There has always been a layer of people against vaccines, anti-vaxxers, and it was partially addressed in the previous presentation as well. But beyond that, beyond people who are against vaccines, there are also the people who are hesitating. So vaccine hesitancy is perhaps not exactly the same, but what should we do or what can we do to further try to work with people who are so fearful of the vaccines? What's been the gap? What have we been missing?
So I'll start off. I think even in Singapore, where there is a very high vaccination rate, in the earlier days, I think we had a challenge that the highest risk populations, the elderly, people more than 70, were the least keen to get vaccinated because of fears, because of hesitation. So it was actually a challenge. And even today, I think there are still pockets of vaccine hesitant and anti-vaxxers in Singapore. And I would say that one of the considerations is probably the lack of a single source of truth. So there's so much information out there. I mean, you go to any agency, government, or university website, you have lots of COVID information.
Yeah.
But I guess that single source of truth where you can actually get reliable and the latest information is probably still missing even today.
Yeah.
And I'll draw the analogy to perhaps the Seet database that tracks the genomic evolution of the virus. So it's tracked 8 million databases, one single source, and I think the whole world looks at them in terms of understanding almost real time the genetic evolution of the virus. But I think that same information source is actually lacking for vaccines.
So do you link it partially to the pervasiveness of social media?
Social media is a part of it, but even when you look at official media, there are so many sources.
Okay.
So it's academic sources, pharmaceutical companies, health ministries, and of course, social media fuels and decides to talk about what it wants to talk about.
Right.
But I think trying to find that single source is a challenge today.
Right. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's a $100 million question, but we have been asking for a long time in each and every country now. You know, and I think it's obviously about information, as you say correctly. It's about information and the right information to the people, and how to direct this information to the people. And this is really the challenge we have been facing. And one aspect is certainly that the social media were more in the hands of the people who were against the vaccination than in the hands of the organizations of, you know, promoting health and global health. So this was certainly one aspect, and also, you know, certainly in different countries, in many countries, it's a collaboration between politics and science, and, you know, the clear agreement how to communicate was really lacking, and maybe information was too complicated, information was too widespread in a sense. So I think learning would be certainly, you know, don't underestimate the social media. Number two is certainly clearer and more crisp information to the people. Will this help at the end? I don't know. So this is, I think, why I said it's a $100 million question. We have a lot of ideas in the moment. It remains to be seen in the future whether these kind of concepts will work.
Right.
Can I add something, Alain?
Of course. Yes, Priya.
I just want to build. I think, you know, I was sort of in South Africa helping the South African government for most of COVID, and then, you know, sort of bouncing between the UK and helping Public Health England, which then became UK Health Security Agency. And my observation was, and it has been even for normal routine immunization programs, is that the communications department is often the least funded when it comes to running immunization programs. We saw this in COVID-19, where it was sort of the afterthought. So building on what the gentleman said, you know, the collaboration and cooperation between all the different stakeholders is key. And investing, you know, we did a lot to think about supply planning and bench science, but we didn't do a lot to think about demand generation activities and behavioral science. So I was hearing what was happening in South Africa. Those that had access and funds, there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy driven by the fact that they didn't trust the source. So one of the problems with one sort of source of truth is if that source of truth is not trusted, you can have the right message, but the messenger is wrong. And then in the underserved, hard to reach populations, there was vaccine irrelevance because actually HIV, TB, malaria, putting food on the table was so much more top of mind than COVID. And there wasn't a lot of communication to say why this was so important. And so, you know, I heard a lot about social media. At the end of the day, social media is an instrument and a tool for all of us to use. And you can either use it for bad outcomes or good outcomes. So one example of a collaboration that we sort of launched, well, it's like a year ago now, was a terribly named, not sexy at all, Alliance for Advancing Health Online. And it was launched with Facebook, now known as Meta, as well as CDC, WHO, and World Bank, because it's fascinating. If you speak to those folk, they know how to influence you to buy a red shoe, and they also know that you went and bought a red shoe. But because of lack of investment in this space, they're really bad at understanding how online activity may be influencing offline health behavior. So we're beginning to fund lots of research in this space, sort of real-time research. There's some research going on in Singapore, in China, Green Foundation in India. And I think learning some of the innovative solutions that could influence positive health behaviors is going to be key, because it's about social networks and using that tool sensibly. So one quick tip for those of you that may use social media and online platforms. If you have a video, you have to ensure subtitles regardless of language or video or audience if you want to get your message across. And you have to get your message across within the first 2.5 seconds. For those of you that use videos, I would question yourself as to whether you actually adhere to those 2 principles that are very well known in any technology company. So I would say collaboration, coordination, conversation, and communities, offline and online, are key. So we learn from what didn't work this time for the next pandemic.
Yeah, so effective communication tools. But trust is also a common denominator here. That's what I've heard on several occasions. Sherry, did you have any additional comments?
Yeah, I'd like to tell 2 stories. The first one is from when I was a medical student, and we were doing a survey on immunization. And our senior professor of community medicine came along with us to a community that was in a relatively remote area, and the children weren't vaccinated. So when we spoke to them, what we figured out was that the diseases that were prevented by immunization were the visitation of a goddess. And the way to treat that, to get rid of that illness, was to brand the children to show that you respected the goddess. So our professor of community medicine then spoke to the people, and he said, well, you know, we have a new improved way of branding. Okay. And it was the BCG scar. Okay? So that was our entry point into that community and the start of immunization programs. So listening to respecting beliefs is really important. The second story I will tell is about COVID-19 and what top-down approaches can mean to remote communities. Well, in another remote village in a different state where I have some friends working, and they told me what had happened when the government program arrived there to vaccinate the village. The village essentially stopped them at the entry point and said, you have not come to us for anything else. You don't come when we call. And you're going to come in here and deliver this immunization because it builds your numbers. We don't want this. So it is about, you know, not doing immunization in isolation. It's about providing a service, it's about communication, it's about building trust, and it's about respecting communities.
Interesting, and we may have to come back to this point because I think the audience is commenting on a few things. But perhaps I want to take you a little bit in a different direction first, and maybe I can call on you, Gerd, first. But in terms of key areas of innovation, what do you expect that we might see in the near future or midterm future? And specifically, as this is a celebration, a relaunch of Hilleman Labs, of course, we have an additional interest in what's the difference between large pharmaceutical companies doing research in vaccines and biotech like a Hilleman?
So let me start with the first part of your question. And you know, when I look at this vaccine field, I think we have seen enormous progress in the field of, you know, delivering technologies like RNA, like adenovirus, like adjuvants. So I think we have worked a lot on the tools, and I think these tools work, and it was very important work and will be important work in the future. And I look here to Reno here, and he will talk about this later. The issue was, and the issue is now really more than the delivery of the vaccine, the understanding, better understanding of the immune system, so what is really leading to protection in the immune system, and even more importantly, when we look at the new diseases or the old diseases where we don't have a vaccine or new diseases coming up, it's a question, what is the right antigen, what are the right structures we have to put in the delivery platforms we have today. And in this area, you know, we are lacking a lot of knowledge. And if you look at the, you know, still not vaccine-covered bacterial diseases, for example, like the nosocomials, Staphylococcus aureus, Klebsiella, and others, we are really lacking the understanding what is really needed for an effective immune response. We are doing much better now in delivering when we have found the right antigens, but I think this will be certainly and must be the focus. And, you know, when I look at my biotechnology history, you know, yes, biotech companies are doing a lot of work in this respect. And, you know, today, and it's not only a question about, you know, Europe, US, but also in low-income countries, innovation is more and more taking place, obviously still at the universities at the first glance, but then in the second in organizations, biotech organizations, and we see more and more that, you know, and this is a story of the last 20 years, that the big pharmaceutical companies, including the vaccine companies, they are, you know, filling their pipeline by biotech innovation and, you know, taking programs when they have overcome the first de-risking step. And I think it will continue in the future in this way because, you know, risk capital we get from venture capital and governments will certainly help to get this innovation done. I think this is what I see as I would think the major trends we have to look at in the future. Second part of your question about Hilleman, yeah, Hilleman definitely would like to be active in both parts. You know, and on one hand side, obviously in the delivery part, which still remains very important, but we certainly also will have projects and activities where we would like to discover new antigens for so far not really vaccine-covered diseases. And, you know, tuberculosis, another nice example where we're not working on, but where I think in the future there needs to be done a lot of more work in understanding disease and antigens.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other thoughts on what the next big things in vaccine development may be and what the role of biotech could be? Any other suggestions, thoughts?
Maybe if I take your earlier question about multinationals and biotech.
Yes, sure.
I think I take this in the context of the advisory committee that I chair that looks at advising the Singapore government on the choice of vaccines and therapeutics.
Yeah.
So in 2020, I think we have met at least 50 academic groups, small companies, big companies. But I think what was very clear in our engagements with the multinationals that have got large vaccine pipelines and small companies or groups that have never brought a vaccine into the clinic before is a great disparity in, I guess, the know-how to do that process. And that know-how cuts across how to conduct a clinical trial, how to file a regulatory campaign, looking at scale-up manufacturing, CMC, supply chain management. And we've seen over the course of 1 year that 50 companies being dwindled down to about 5 or 6 after we do the repeated engagements to look at the science, look at the scale-up. And ultimately it was scale-up that actually was the main limiting factor.
Yeah. So a lack of expertise, a lack of tools, and perhaps the right people in some of the companies.
I mean, if you look at it, if you take a big company, I mean, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, I'll assume that the entire regulatory or clinical trial department or division is probably bigger than the entire biotech company.
Right.
And particularly when they're trying to engage multiple jurisdictions across different parts of the world, I think it was extremely complicated for small companies.
Yeah.
And when we spoke to our regulatory authorities, they actually used the word hand-holding. So there's a lot of hand-holding in terms of saying the filing is not up to standard, and there was actually a lot of work on the part of the regulatory authority to bring it up to the acceptable standards.
Right. Good. Sherry or
So I think
Priya?
one of the things is, what have we learned during this pandemic that we should preserve in ways of working together? We've seen collaborations between biotech and big companies that worked. Now, is that a model to be supported and promoted for the future? That's certainly something for us to think about. But I think for Hilleman, this is a time of refreshing strategy and beginning already to think about what kinds of academic partnerships on one hand, what kinds of larger partnerships on the other would be worthwhile to think about, is something that is already in train and should be sustained. And there should be many more Hillemans in other parts of the world. So there's a lot for all of us to do. We've learned a lot, but building on what Gerd said, understanding immune responses, understanding antibody responses is critical for the science part. The only thing that I will add that we came too late in this pandemic is looking at subpopulations and being able to build for vaccines and vaccinations for certain kinds of subpopulations. And I hope that next time we will incorporate that into development efforts.
Right, okay, thank you. Priya, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't want to repeat what the other panelists have said. I guess the only thing in addition to the platforms comment is that, I think we also learned that we probably need improved adjuvant technology. It's going to be important in the future. And I think we need adjuvants that fundamentally have better tolerability profiles. And I think we're just scratching the surface as it relates to alternative delivery devices. We have such few exceptions to the typical injection for vaccines. And I think when we think about vaccination and getting the vaccines to the people, that last inch that Julie Gerberding talked about, we need advancements in delivery that can fundamentally change the game.
Yeah, good. So maybe segueing a little bit back to what you earlier said, Benjamin, that some of the biotechs may not be successful. So what are the most critical things that we feel are problematic in terms of vaccine development? Is it all about discovery? Is it the financing part? Is it the final part of getting the vaccines to the people? In the whole value chains, what are the most brittle points?
I don't think it's discovery, because if you look today, I've probably lost count on the number of development projects that have gone into man, probably about 200 to 300.
Yeah.
So there is probably no lack of preclinical discovery, early development of the vaccine. But I think as it gets to clinical trials, at this point in time, I think it's going to be very hard. Obviously, because there are substantial populations that are already vaccinated, and a very high benchmark set by the current mRNA vaccines. Yeah. So I think that high benchmark is good because it works. But at the same time, I guess for new vaccines coming in, there will be challenges in terms of trying to manage their phase 3 trials, whether it's through immune bridging or other correlates of protection. But again, I'll still go back that the last mile of turning a successful vaccine into something that can be made in the millions and distributed globally, I'll say that's probably the biggest challenge.
Okay, the scale up.
The scaling up. I think when we look at what AstraZeneca has done, there's a lot of second source manufacturing. I think they are working with something 25 different factories in 10 countries. I think that's probably part of the way in terms of how do you work with multiple manufacturing sites.
Well, AstraZeneca doesn't have a seat here today, so it wouldn't be proper to talk too much perhaps about them, but there was a lot left to be said. But at the same time, if you look at the strategy of BioNTech Pfizer, they also outsourced a lot.
That's right.
So while one track was commercially highly successful, the other had major roadblocks, right? For a variety of reasons. Sherry, you look puzzled.
I don't think I really have anything to add to what Benjamin said.
Gerd, you've been in the industry for a long time, so you may have other perspectives.
Yeah, so I probably would see a little bit different in the sense that, I still believe that the discovery and especially in the antigen discovery is a field where we're really lacking progress. So you look at diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and I could make a longer list. We still don't know really what needs to be put in the vaccine as antigens, what are the right delivery platforms to use for that, what are the right antigens, what are the right adjuvants to be added. So I think this is certainly a field which in the moment really holds a lot of progress. The second point I fully agree is on the phase 3 studies and the late stage studies, where in many of the diseases I was just mentioning and many others, we face a situation that the case incidences are relatively low. And to execute clinical studies with low case incidences would mean enormous effort, hundreds of thousands of patients, long lead times to get the studies done, enormous financial work. So efficacy studies in many areas will not be anymore possible or feasible. So correlates of protections, animal rule, I think these type of future developments will be very important to get the remaining major vaccine challenges being done.
Right, okay. Now that's when we're talking COVID, but what if we talk about the industry in general? What do you think are the most brittle points taking a vaccine from its early stages all the way trying to deliver? What have you seen repetitively?
Yeah, I think it's at the end what I just said, certainly the phase 3 part, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for the vaccines to be made now. And and getting the respective financing and support, not only from venture capital, but also from public sources.
Right.
And we have seen in COVID there was billions of public money being pumped into organizations and companies. Maybe 80% was going in the wrong direction, but at least that 20% was going in the right direction to make it happen.
Yeah, thank you. I get some comments also from the audience. Wanted to go to one of them. COVID has shown that we are underinvested in vaccine R&D, both in the public and private sector. Which areas specifically are most critically underinvested today in your view? Open question from the audience.
I think, certainly for problems that are large problems for the entire world, there is a lot of investment from multinational companies. But if you begin to look at what diseases are more local, there is less interest in making vaccines for those. And part of the reason that CEPI was established was really to address that issue of market failure. There's some early stage research, it doesn't move really into clinical development, and these are problems that big companies don't generally take on. So I think CEPI is addressing 5 viruses and platform technologies. But if we were to do a scanning of diseases around the world, there are many more that are tractable for vaccines. And we haven't really begun to work on them or to try to make better vaccines for them. The other part that I think is, there used to be public sector manufacturing of vaccines in many LMICs. That has switched now to private sector manufacturing, and those private sector manufacturers, particularly in low and middle income countries and in places like India in particular, the profit margin for those companies is very small, and they wind up not investing in new technologies or in R&D until there is a crisis and a partnership. So if we were to think about not always making, I think Cyrus Poonawalla was quoted very recently as saying that vaccines in India are the same price as a cup of tea now. But we need vaccines and vaccine manufacturers to have resources to be able to invest in better technologies and in better research and development. And then, of course, is the whole area of what can we do to change clinical testing. Gerd alluded to that phase 3 trials are hard and difficult to do, but what are the substitutes for phase 3 trials or large phase 3 trials that regulators will accept? Is animal rule plus a combination of some form of correlative protection going to be sufficient? How do we work together with regulators to address these issues? I think there will be plenty of challenges for us in the future, and underinvestment is at practically every step in the pipeline.
So regulatory flexibility could be part of the answer. That's what I hear from you. Yeah. Interesting perspective.
Yeah. I would like also to comment to this, this question a little bit. So I don't think that we are underinvested when it comes to, and this is maybe the key of the problem here, when we talk about, you know, diseases which create, vaccines which create a huge market potential. So, and in the moment how innovation works in many countries is that, you know, you only get money as a biotech company or an institution if you can really show that there's a commercial benefit. Then the big companies will take it off and then they move it. But without commercial benefit, we don't get enough money to do what we need to do. And it brings me back to Hilleman. We obviously have the, like many other organizations which are having a similar vision and mission, we really try to work on these type of vaccines where biotech would not really touch, or where big pharmaceutical companies wouldn't touch, because it's just not enough business. And I think we have to strengthen this sector a lot for global health, because if we don't do that, for many diseases, we will never see vaccines of good enough quality and good enough efficacy.
All right. Thank you. Priya, can you follow the conversation well enough? And I was wondering what your thoughts are.
I can, thank you. I don't think I have anything to add to what the others have said, thank you.
Right, so there's another question here from the audience. Should vaccine research and development be centralized and globally financed under an international body? Perhaps that's a bit of a lead to the CEPI mechanism also. And should the resulting vaccine IPs, intellectual property, be made open source, public property? So that's the whole question, I guess, around ethics, using public financing for something that becomes a private good. Is that acceptable or not acceptable? It seems to be what has happened though, right?
If you look, just last week, there was a publication on the COVID moonshot. And this was quite interesting because it was a crowdsourced, open source effort for people around the world to actually find candidates or leads to target the protease, the main protease in the COVID virus. Yeah. And I think they did that in a totally crowdsourced open science approach, IP-free, so that's new too. But through this process, there was quite a lot of sharing of information. They shared the crystallography, they shared the PK/PD, biochemistry, and so on. And ultimately, it actually led to a group of 250 people from around the world collectively developing the medicinal chemistry to develop a new small molecule against COVID-19. Yeah. And it was totally done through a crowdsource. Of course, there was some central funding, right. But I think that goes beyond public or private sector. This is open source. Right. And it opens an opportunity to look at the drug development quite differently.
Right. So these things, as we hear from the discussion, can have an impact on final price and access. Although what we hear from Sherry also, it's quite complicated, right? If things are made very cheap, like some Indian manufacturers would experience going for the bottom line of a certain product, then there is no incentive to come with further innovation. So how do you sustain that system? if nothing else is coming in, if there's no return, where will you get the money to do more?
Well, I think it's always a challenge. And that's why I referred to public sector manufacturing earlier, because public sector manufacturing was kind of this, not vaccine research, but centralized vaccine development and then deployment through the government system, where there wasn't really a restriction on, you know, all the Institute Pasteurs, for example, used to make vaccines at one point in time. And they were very valuable for the companies where they were located. But in many places, they didn't keep up with evolving standards of vaccine manufacture or new technologies. And that led to challenges that then resulted in that shift to private sector manufacturing becoming the more viable option, even for government programs. Now, should everything be centralized and globally financed? I think it depends on what your real priorities are. In some senses, CEPI supports research and development, but it doesn't do it itself. So it's not an international body that is doing vaccine research and development. It's helping people through support mechanisms and financial resources and bringing other players to the table to take vaccine R&D forward. Yep. And certainly, one of the things that is built into CEPI is equitable access into every agreement. And in CEPI 1.0, what we found is that if you are building an equitable access into agreements when you are doing early stage funding, phase 1 funding, et cetera, but you're not the person buying the vaccine, then it's very hard to maintain those agreements if you're not the purchaser. So I think the whole ecosystem does need to evolve. I don't think that there is a single solution to how we can do things for equitable access.
You know, I fully share what Jerry just said, but you know, I would not like to underestimate the, you know, feasibility and power of innovation in biotechs and industry. You know, somehow driven by money, but you know, this has been in the past a motor to really get the innovation and make it happen. So to centralize it or put it in a fully international body, I think would be really show that we don't get the right innovation being done. And look at different sectors like the IT sector, the smartphone sector, the electric car sector, and so whatever. A lot of innovation has been driven by private companies, people. And I think we should not underestimate that aspect of vaccine development.
So bringing it under a centralized governance would stifle the research spirit.
Yeah.
Good. I have one more burning question, actually. If there was one thing you could do to change the world of vaccine development or manufacturing or uptake, what's the critical thing you would want to see changed? One piece.
I think we've talked a lot already. I mean, we've covered discovery, manufacturing, and maybe I'll go to regulatory. Yeah. Because when I look at that we're in the midst of a pandemic, but almost every country is still regulating the introduction of new vaccines and therapeutics using very similar structures as they did in the past. And what it means for a biotech company, particularly a smaller one, is that if you want to bring your vaccine to 50 countries, you have to negotiate it 50 times. Slightly different packages, maybe some standardization of the packages. And on the flip side, for a country that's reviewing a couple of vaccines and therapeutics, a very small team has to actually do that due diligence on a number of assets at the same time. Yeah. So I think there is a lot of inefficiencies and redundancy in that process, and some form of harmonization could work in a pandemic. It does not work, as we know, in a peacetime situation. But in a pandemic where everyone should actually be focusing on getting vaccines to people, the regulatory process, I think, today has a lot of inefficiencies. How we can change that, I have no idea.
Right, yes, yes. And more room for harmonization, even though there has been the ICH initiative over the last 20 years, but there is room for more. Yeah. And strange enough, with the harmonization, there's still sometimes a local interpretation on the harmonization text, so that leaves a lot of gaps.
And the forms could be different.
Correct, yes. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, Sherry?
I'd invest in early science. If this pandemic has shown anything, it's that prior investments made us move forward very rapidly. So I think, and that was through investing in diseases that were not at that stage, pandemics. So the MERS, the SARS, science led to SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. So I think understanding pathogens, understanding immune responses is critical.
So basic science?
Absolutely.
More investment in basic R&D. Priya, what would be your thoughts? What's the one thing you would put your money on?
Yeah, so I agree. I think critical objective is to prioritize the shortening of the end-to-end discovery to delivery cycle. So if I had a magic wand, it would be also global regulatory harmonization. There's such high heterogeneity in terms of dossier review, approval process, and timelines, each country having specific data requirements. So if we could have global regulatory harmonization, we would really increase the speed to access.
It is remarkable, and I have to agree, having worked in large industry also before, it is complex, and it's a drain on resources also. Even early stages, early development already, just to be sure that your program is geared towards a license in all the individual countries. It is very often very complex to design your trials. It doesn't simplify your phase 3 trials, for instance, Gerd, as you mentioned before, because you have to watch so many different aspects and please so many different regulators in different ways. Not an easy thing. Gerd, if there was one thing you could change, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it's really about a question we have been discussing a lot already in this conference and before. It's about, access of vaccines in low and middle income countries. I think there has been a tremendous movement there, tremendous improvement, but we are still far, far away from being optimal. And I would like to see more solidarity, from countries having access to, and the COVID showed it very clearly, having access to top-class vaccines, that they also see more responsibility towards giving this innovation at fair prices to low and middle income countries. And despite of all efforts, we have a lot in front of us to be here really optimal and successful.
So with
Alain,
this,
can I just add something very briefly?
Yes, please.
For some of us, we lost yesterday Paul Farmer, with his passing, who was a huge advocate for health equity. He's known for saying equity is the only acceptable goal. But what's interesting is when he talked about private sector and the role of innovators, he said, and lab scientists, right? He said, innovations do not cause the equity gap. Innovations without a plan for equity cause the equity gap. And so when someone asked that question about centralized global research and science, I'm not sure that's a solution. I think the underlying thing was how we're going to achieve health equity. I think there should be an environment and an ecosystem and pressure to whoever works, and it's a big network of us that ensure vaccines get to the people, that those who are innovating are partnered with those who can support the equity plan. And that should be the mandate that's put out there from a centralized global institution, not that the science and the manufacturing development needs to be centralized. It's about having an equity plan for the innovations.
Thank you, thank you. We have come to the end of our hour, and I feel like we could have continued much longer. It would be injustice to the next speakers, however. I want to thank all panelists, and Priya, also you, because you're in the United States, so this was really an early call for you, but thank you so much. Thank you for your contributions, and I hope this was useful to everyone.